I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper. Right? This is a future occurrence. If the Father and the Holy Spirit are simply the same spirit, or the same, I'm using air quotes with my fingers, being or person, right? I believe they are the same being, but not the same person. If the Holy Spirit and the Father are simply the same person, or the same entity, the same spirit, then why is this a future promise that Yeshua is giving to them that has to wait until Yeshua leaves, right? Until Yeshua vacates planet Earth, then the Spirit ascends. Because this would almost suggest that the Father wasn't present, and yet all throughout the Tanakh, the Father is present. So what's Yeshua talking about? That he's going to send something that's not there, a thing, a presence, a person, a spirit who isn't present now? Right? No good Jew, no good religious Jew of the first century who was worth his salt in understanding the Tanakh, the Old Testament, would suggest that God wasn't present in Israel as a people, that God was not there with the people. So that when Yeshua hit the scene and started talking about the Father, everyone knew he's talking about the Spirit of God who was already there. Right? The Spirit is here. He's working miracles and doing things among us. Likewise, Paul would never suggest that the Spirit of God is not present, and yet Yeshua's talking about something future. The Spirit can be sent because he is a person that is sent by God to do God's will and God's bidding. And I get this pushback from Unitarian Christians all the time telling me that the Spirit of God is simply God himself. And yes, that is the way that the bulk of the Bible talks about the Spirit of God. I grant them that. So that's the first passage we're going to look at tonight. The second one is that God is, or God the Spirit is, he's everywhere. He's everywhere. Let's look at Psalm 139, 7 through 10. The psalmist writes, starting in verse 7, "Where shall I go from your spirit, or where shall I flee from your presence?" In verse 8, he says, "If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in sha'ul, you are there." Verse 9, "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea." And then verse 10, "Even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me." So, interestingly enough, the psalmist starts out by addressing God, and he says, "Where shall I go from your spirit?" Poetically speaking, the psalmist is saying, "Where shall I go from you, O Lord? Where shall I flee from your presence?" Right? There is the idea in the Old Testament that the Spirit of God represents the presence of God, the mind of God, the power of God, the essence of God. In some cases, manifest presence of God. If we talked about the light, if a light show is introduced and things like that. So it's not wrong to affirm that the Spirit of God is very God, and that the Spirit represents the presence of God and the power of God to move and motivate and come upon a person. I understand that, and I affirm that. The only point I'm trying to add is that extra detail is given to us in the New Testament as far as the fact that the Holy Spirit is actually a separate person of God who has his own personality and can actually even intercede for saints on behalf of us and God. Remember, when we're going to get to this, when we get to Romans chapter 8, in order for intercession to take place, there has to be at least three parties, right? You have party A and party B. Intercessor is the third party, party C, the person who comes along in between party A and party B and intercedes on behalf, like an advocate, like a lawyer, right? Like your district attorney who's interceding on behalf of you and the judge. Otherwise, the judge just pronounces the sentence and there's no due process. The DA or the attorney, the lawyer, he's the one that's pleading your case, right? Trying to show that you're innocent. He's interceding for you. Well, that's what's kind of going on with the Holy Spirit. He intercedes for us. Later on in Romans, to make things a little more complicated, Paul's going to say that Jesus is the one that intercedes for us, right? Well, who is it? Is the Spirit interceding, or is it Jesus interceding? The answer is yes. All right, so but not to jump ahead of myself. So the psalmist says the Spirit is everywhere. He's omnipresent. Where can the psalmist go where he can flee from the Spirit of God? So obviously the Spirit has the same qualities as God, the same characteristics of God. He's fully God. And so he's fully divine. He's not limited, like the example of electricity. If the Holy Spirit is simply a power that emanates from God, like electricity flows throughout my apartment, well, then unfortunately it's limited, because there are some rooms in my apartment that don't have electricity. There's no outlet for me to access it. There's no wiring. And there are some rooms that have it, but not so with God. Everywhere God is, the Spirit is. And everywhere the Spirit is, God is. And yet God can localize his Spirit so that the Spirit of God hovers over the surface of the waters. And at the same time, the reader understands that God is still enthroned in heaven. Understand what I'm saying? God can dispatch his Spirit to do his bidding and remain stationary, as it were, where he was when he started, as if God was kind of localized, right? Using kind of anthropomorphisms to explain how God can be enthroned in heaven, yet he's omnipresent. Right? Both of those are truth statements, and yet from our perspective as humans, we sometimes have to visualize God being localized, right? Concentrating his glory or presence in an earthly address for a brief moment or something like that. All right, and then the third passage is that God is all-knowing, right? He's omnipotent. He's omniscient. He knows everything. This would make sense because the mind of God and the mind of the Spirit are overlapping, or they're synonymous, or in some cases, the verses, they have separate minds as persons. One will and another will, and they agree with one another. But yet, the Holy Spirit is fully God, and he knows everything just like God knows everything. He doesn't lack in knowledge. Let's look at this. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 2. Starting in verse 10. I think, what did the reference say? 10 through 11, but I want to actually back up to verse 9. Let's read that one there.